I didn't know my marriage was about to end over dinner. Not during a screaming fight, not after catching him cheating, not even after a dramatic confession whispered through tears. It ended quietly, across a polished dining table, with a glass of wine in my hand and my husband's family watching me like entertainment. My name is Jane Morrison. I'm 36 years old, and until that night, I believed I was a respected wife in a powerful family. I was wrong. The dinner was supposed to be harmless, a celebration dinner at my in-laws' house. Hardwood floors, expensive art, the kind of home that smells like money and permanence. We were seated neatly, my husband Michael Sterling beside me, his brother Brandon Sterling across the table, their parents at the head like judges who'd already reached a verdict. Conversation drifted until someone asked about my latest project, a library. I explained the redesign calmly. Community spaces, a digital learning center, access for underfunded neighborhoods. I spoke the way I always did, careful, measured, professional. Brandon interrupted. How civic-minded, he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. But what does something like that pay these days? I felt the shift immediately, the subtle tightening of the room. Michael didn't say anything. It's not about the money, I said evenly. It's about creating something that serves people. Brandon took a slow sip of wine. Must be nice to work on passion projects when someone else is paying your mortgage. The silence landed heavy, physical. My fork hovered midair. I contribute to our household, I said. Oh, of course you do, Brandon replied smoothly. It's just, we all know Michael's family trust is the real breadwinner in your marriage. I looked at my husband. He didn't look back. That was the moment something cold settled in my chest. Not anger, not shock. Recognition. Because I realized, sitting there under those crystal lights, that this wasn't just dinner conversation. This was a verdict, and I was about to find out exactly how expendable I was. Before that dinner, before the words that sliced so cleanly they barely hurt at first, I believed my life had followed a reasonable, even admirable trajectory. I was 36, an architect specializing in urban redevelopment, libraries, community centers, public spaces people didn't brag about on social media, but relied on quietly every day. I loved patterns, structures, the way good design could make people feel seen without announcing itself. I met Michael Sterling 8 years earlier. It wasn't at a gala or a charity auction, despite what his brother later implied. It was at a zoning review meeting, one of those endless municipal sessions where nothing seems to move until suddenly everything does. Michael sat across the table in a tailored suit, confident, articulate, undeniably polished. He spoke with ease about investment, long-term vision, legacy. I spoke about function, flow, and access. We disagreed, and afterward he followed me out of the building. You made a good argument, he said, smiling. Most people just want to win. You actually care if the building works. That mattered to me. Michael was attentive in the beginning, curious. He asked about my work, my upbringing in Cleveland, my parents, teachers who taught me discipline and humility, not ambition for ambition's sake. He liked that I was different from the women he usually dated. He said I grounded him. I believed him. Dating Michael meant entering a different world. His family name carried weight. His parents, Charles and Patricia Sterling, moved through rooms like they owned the air itself. Dinners were formal, conversations strategic. Everything was measured. Reputation, connections, appearances. From the start, I was pleasantly surprising. Not impressive. Not equal. Surprising. Patricia praised my manners. Charles complimented my restraint. Brandon, Michael's older brother, watched me like I was an experiment he hadn't decided the outcome of yet. Still, Michael reassured me. They're intense, he said. Don't take it personally. You're not from their world. I didn't realize then that not from their world would become a permanent classification. We married 2 years later. Michael proposed with a ring chosen by his mother. The wedding was beautiful and enormous and mostly paid for by the Sterling family. I told myself that didn't matter, that partnerships didn't need to be perfectly balanced to be healthy. I moved into Michael's house in Newport, his house, though we never said it that way out loud. I kept my last name. Michael never asked me to take his. At the time, I told myself it was progressive. Later, I understood it differently. Marriage didn't change my role with his family. I was still the architect wife, the one with nice projects, the one who worked because she wanted to, not because she needed to. At holidays, Brandon made jokes about my hobby career. Michael smiled awkwardly, never corrected him. And slowly, without a single dramatic moment, I learned how to shrink. I learned when to stay quiet, when to let comments slide, when to tell myself that love required patience. By the time we reached that dinner, the night everything cracked, I had already spent years convincing myself that respect would come if I proved myself useful enough. I didn't yet understand that no amount of proving was ever going to change the verdict. Looking back now, it's painfully clear that the dinner wasn't the beginning of the conflict. It was just the moment I finally stopped pretending not to see it. The signs had been there for years. Quiet, cumulative, easy to excuse when you loved someone and wanted the marriage to work. Michael started changing first, not in obvious ways. He didn't grow cruel or distant overnight. Instead, he became selective. He chose when to listen and when to disengage. He'd nod while I talked about my projects, but his eyes would drift to his phone. He stopped asking follow-up questions, stopped remembering deadlines that mattered to me. When I pointed it out, gently, he'd smile and say, "You know how busy things are right now." Busy was always temporary, except it never was. His family became bolder. Brandon, especially, began treating dinners like a stage. Every gathering came with a story. Another deal closed, another loophole exploited, another win that proved how clever he was. And threaded through it all were comments aimed squarely at me. "Still working on those community things? You could make real money if you wanted." I admire people who don't care about status. They were delivered with a grin, framed as compliments, impossible to challenge without looking defensive. Michael never laughed, but he never stopped it either. Once, after Brandon joked about me playing architect while Michael handled actual assets, I said something. I asked Michael later why he didn't say anything. "He didn't mean it that way," Michael replied. "You're reading too much into it." That was the phrase he used most often. "You're reading too much into it. They're just joking. You know how Brandon is. Don't make things awkward." Awkward became my responsibility to manage. Then there was the money. I paid my share, always had. Utilities, groceries, renovations I insisted on funding myself because I didn't want leverage held over me. But the house, the cars, the vacations, those were sterling assets, and everyone knew it. At first, it was unspoken. Later, it wasn't. Patricia once introduced me at a charity luncheon as Michael's wife. She works because it keeps her fulfilled. I smiled because correcting her would have caused a scene. Scenes were unacceptable. Michael's silence became a pattern. When his parents criticized my work choices, when Brandon questioned my intelligence disguised as humor, when his family discussed my marriage like a transaction I'd benefited from. The worst part wasn't what they said. It was watching Michael hear it and choose comfort over me. I started noticing inconsistencies too. Brandon's stories didn't add up. Deals that made no sense. Numbers that shifted depending on the audience. He was careless, arrogant in a way only people who believe themselves untouchable can be. At first, I noticed it professionally. Architects are trained to see structural flaws, stress points, things that don't align. Then I noticed it personally. Late night calls Brandon took outside. Documents left open on shared devices. Jokes about creative accounting that landed a little too precisely. I didn't go looking. But once you see cracks in a structure, you can't unsee them. Still, I said nothing, because confronting Brandon meant confronting the family. And confronting the family meant asking Michael to choose. I wasn't ready to see that answer yet. So I kept swallowing discomfort, kept telling myself marriage required endurance, kept believing that if I stayed calm, useful, non-threatening, respect would eventually follow. By the time we sat down at that dinner, the night Brandon finally said everything out loud, I had already been standing on fractured ground for a long time. I just didn't know how close I was to falling through it. The moment Brandon crossed the line, it wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was surgical. After his comment about the trust fund, I felt every eye at the table slide toward me. Not with curiosity, but expectation. Like this was the part of the evening where I was supposed to laugh, deflect, smooth things over so everyone could keep enjoying their wine. I didn't. I married Michael because I love him, I said, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. Brandon tilted his head, studying me like a specimen that had just spoken out of turn. Did you? He asked lightly. Or did you love the idea of him? The whole package deal, the lifestyle upgrade. My jaw tightened. I set my fork down carefully, afraid that if I held it any longer, I might bend it. You don't know anything about our relationship, I said. Don't I? Brandon leaned back, clearly enjoying himself. Let me guess. You met at some event Michael was obligated to attend. You were charming, self-deprecating, played up the whole diamond in the rough thing. He smiled. And my brother has always had a savior complex. Each word landed with precision. Clean. Deliberate. That's enough, Charles said. But there was no real authority behind it. He looked mildly entertained, like this was a debate unfolding exactly as expected. I pushed my chair back slightly. The scrape against the hardwood sounded louder than it should have. Sit down, Michael said quietly. Not to defend me, to control me. Yes, Brandon echoed, grinning. Sit down. Don't be so sensitive. We're family here. Just honesty. Honesty? I repeated. Is that what you call this? What would you call it? His eyes glittered. I'd call it a man compensating for his insecurities by attacking someone he thinks can't fight back. The temperature in the room dropped. Brandon set his glass down with deliberate care. That's bold, he said, coming from a woman living in a house my brother owns, driving a car my family leases, wearing a watch my mother bought her. Patricia made a small, half-hearted sound, like she meant to intervene but didn't quite care enough. No, Mom, Brandon continued smoothly. Let me clarify something. He leaned forward, locking eyes with me. You're not one of us. You never will be. You're a charity case Michael took pity on. And the only reason we tolerate you is because he hasn't gotten bored yet and traded you in for someone with actual pedigree. Something cold crystallized in my chest. Not anger. Certainty. I looked at Michael. This time, I didn't ask him with my eyes. I waited. He met my gaze for half a second, then looked away. That silence did more damage than Brandon ever could. Well, Brandon said, spreading his hands. Nothing to say. I stood. Jane, Michael's voice sharpened. Don't make a scene. Scene? I asked quietly. I'm not making a scene. I'm leaving. You'll do no such thing, he said, his face flushing. Sit down. Why? Because my feelings, I said slowly. Your brother just called our marriage a con job, and you want me to sit here and accept it? I stared at him, stunned. Michael, I said, my voice cracking despite myself. He said I married you for money. Tell him he's wrong. Brandon chuckled softly. Partially, I ignored him, keeping my eyes on my husband. Tell him I married you because I love you. Michael's mouth opened, closed. His eye, of course. That was when something inside me broke. Not violently. Not dramatically. It cracked. Apologize to my brother, Michael said suddenly, his voice sharp. You've been rude all night. I've barely spoken. Exactly, he snapped. You've been judging everyone. Apologize to Brandon or get out of my house. My house, not ours. The room went very still. Everyone was watching. And in that moment, I understood something with devastating clarity. No one at that table believed I belonged there, including the man I married. I don't remember deciding to move. I just remember standing there 1 second, and then my body carrying me forward the next. Michael stiffened when I stepped away from my chair. I felt it in the room, that collective intake of breath, the silent assumption that I was about to beg, to apologize, to restore order. I walked toward Brandon. Michael reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing my wrist, not in support, but in warning. I shook him off without looking back. Brandon was still smirking when I stopped in front of him, close enough to see the faint redness in his cheeks from the wine, close enough to smell the expensive cologne he favored, sharp, arrogant, overconfident. He was enjoying this. He was certain he'd won. I let the silence stretch. Then I spoke one sentence. Your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands hold $19 million in untaxed income. The room collapsed into stillness. Not anticipation, not shock. The kind of silence that follows a gunshot. Brandon's smile vanished, not slowly, instantly. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then something raw and unmistakable. Fear. You're bluffing, he whispered. I reached into my bag and placed a small flash drive on the table between us. I did it gently, almost tenderly. Am I? Michael stared at the drive like it might explode. Jane, he said hoarsely, what is this? I didn't look at him. I couldn't, not yet. Your brother runs a shell company called Apex Advisory Group, I said calmly. My voice didn't shake. It surprised me how steady it was. Registered in Delaware, operates through the Caymans. It exists solely to help clients evade taxes. Patricia let out a sound, a thin, broken whimper. I have the incorporation documents, I continued, bank statements, client lists, internal emails where Brandon discusses the illegality of the operation in his own words. Charles pushed back from the table so abruptly, his chair toppled. That's impossible, he said. It isn't, I replied. I finally looked at Michael. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide and searching, like he was seeing me for the first time and didn't recognize what he found. I also have evidence of bribes paid to a county official, I went on. Insider trading and skimming from the family trust. Small amounts, nothing you'd notice at first, but over 5 years, it totals about $400,000. Why? Michael whispered. Why? The question cracked something open inside me. Because I loved you, I said. And I thought if I understood your world, if I could protect your family's interests, maybe they'd respect me. Maybe you would. Michael recoiled like I'd struck him. You spied on my family, he demanded. You threatened my brother? I wasn't going to use it, I said quickly. I swear, I collected it as insurance, as proof that I wasn't stupid, that I belonged. Brandon laughed then, a thin, desperate sound. This is extortion. No, I said. Extortion would mean I want something. I don't. I looked around the table, at the people I'd spent 8 years trying to please. On Monday, I continued, the IRS, the SEC, and the California Attorney General's office will receive everything. Charles stood. Jane, let's talk about this. We can come to an arrangement. There is no arrangement. Michael stepped toward me, panic bleeding into anger. You don't get to do this, he said. This is my family, my life. I can, I replied quietly, and I am. I slid my wedding ring off my finger and placed it beside his plate. I want a divorce. No, Michael said immediately. You're upset. You don't mean that. I do. He grabbed my wrist this time, tighter. If you walk out that door, he said, voice shaking, don't come back. I met his eyes. I won't. And if you submit that evidence, he added, my father's lawyers will destroy you. I know, I said. I didn't care. And for the first time in years, that truth felt like freedom. I walked out of the Sterling house with nothing but my phone, my wallet, and the flash drive still warm in my palm. Behind me, I heard Michael's voice rise, sharp, panicked. Then Patricia's sobs. Then Brandon shouting about lawyers and injunctions. I didn't turn around. If I had, I might have faltered, and I couldn't afford that. Outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, my breath shallow, my hands trembling now that the performance was over. Then I called an Uber. While I waited, my phone buzzed. Michael, please come back. We can talk about this. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Talk. That was all it had ever been. Talk that led nowhere. I blocked his number. Another message came through, this one from an unknown contact. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Brandon. Blocked. The car arrived. I slid into the back seat, pressed my forehead against the window, and watched the city lights blur. My mind raced forward, backward, everywhere at once. I had a small apartment downtown, an office space I'd kept under my own name. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That was when my phone rang. A woman's voice, professional, measured. "Miss Morrison, this is Jennifer Hayes with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I received an interesting package at my office this evening." My blood went cold. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "What package?" "A flash drive. No return address. It contains evidence of tax fraud and money laundering related to Brandon Sterling and an entity called Apex Advisory Group." I sat upright. "I didn't send that." "The postmark suggests it was mailed 3 days ago," she continued. 3 days before tonight's dinner." I closed my eyes. "I don't understand." "Neither do I," she said, "which is why I'd like to ask you some questions. Would you be available to come to my office tomorrow?" "Am I in trouble?" "That depends," she replied calmly. "Did you compile this evidence?" I thought about lying, about Michael's threat, about the army of lawyers his family could deploy. "Yes," I said. "I compiled it." "And why would you mail it to us now?" "I didn't," I said, my voice steady. "I have the flash drive in my pocket right now." Silence. "So," she said finally, "there are 2 copies." "Yes." She exhaled softly. "Ms. Morrison, tax fraud is serious, but corruption on this scale? That's the kind of case that changes careers." "I'm not looking for a career," I said. "No," she replied, "but you might be looking for protection. Cooperate with our investigation, and you'll be treated as a federal witness. The Sterlings are powerful people. If they think you expose them, they will come after you." The city slid past my window, indifferent. "I need time to think." "You have until Monday," she said. "That's when we formally open the investigation." She hung up. When I arrived at my apartment, my hands were still shaking. Inside, my inbox held a single new email. No sender name. Subject: "You're welcome." I opened it. "Jane, you don't know me, but I know you. I watched you compile evidence for 2 years. I watched you hope that being smart would earn respect from people who only value power. My name is Amy Richardson. I was Brandon's assistant for 3 years. I saw everything. 3 days ago, I copied your files and sent them to the IRS. By Monday, Brandon will be arrested. You might hate me for taking the choice away, but they never would have let you walk away." I lit the match. "Cooperate with the IRS. Tell the truth. Then start over. You deserve better than them, Amy." I read it 3 times. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my entire world had already been set on fire before I'd even walked into that dining room. By the time Brandon mocked me, by the time Michael chose his family, the countdown had already started. My phone rang again. "Michael," I answered. "Please tell me this is a nightmare," he said, his voice broken. "I'm not doing anything," I replied quietly. "Someone already submitted the evidence. The investigation starts Monday." Silence. "Who?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, not quite a lie. "Come home," he begged. "We'll face this together." "No," I said. "I want a divorce." "You're leaving me because of one dinner?" "No," I replied. "Because of every night for the last 8 years." He didn't argue after that. Neither of us needed to. The first night alone felt unreal. Not dramatic, just hollow. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed in my downtown apartment, still wearing the clothes from dinner, staring at a blank wall that didn't know my name, my history, or the version of myself I just burned to the ground. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loud, in the way only aftermath can be. I had walked away from everything familiar in a single evening, my marriage, my home, my assumed future. And now that the adrenaline was gone, fear crept in, slow, persistent, rational. Michael's words echoed in my head. "My father's lawyers will destroy you." I knew what the Sterlings were capable of. They didn't lose quietly. They buried people with process, money, and narrative. And I was no longer protected by proximity. I was exposed. I slept badly, waking every hour, heart racing, convinced I'd missed a call, a threat, a knock at the door. Every sound in the hallway felt like the beginning of consequences. By morning, the news cycle had already started to turn. Whispers first, then speculation, anonymous sources, family insider, bitter spouse. My lawyer, someone I'd hired with what little savings I had, was blunt. "They're going to smear you," she said. "Affairs, professional misconduct, anything to make you look unstable or vengeful. And if they succeed, they don't have to win," she replied. "They just have to exhaust you." That night, I cried. Not loudly, not theatrically. I cried the way people do when they finally stop holding their breath. I cried for the woman I'd been when I met Michael, the one who believed competence would earn respect. I cried for every dinner I'd swallowed discomfort to preserve harmony. I cried for the years I'd spent shrinking myself to fit into a family that had never intended to make space for me. And for the first time since leaving, I doubted myself. What if I'd overreacted? What if I'd destroyed lives unnecessarily? What if I'd confused pride with principle? I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, pale, exhausted, older than I'd felt in years. Was I really strong? Or had I just finally snapped? The phone buzzed. A notification. Breaking news. Federal authorities open investigation into Sterling-linked offshore entities. My hands went numb. This was real now. Public. Permanent. Within hours, articles followed. Some careful, some cruel. One headline called me the architect who brought down a dynasty. Another framed me as a disgruntled wife seeking revenge. Michael didn't call. Instead, a message came through from a blocked number that slipped past my filters. "You've ruined everything." I didn't need the name. That night, alone in my apartment, I reached the lowest point. Not because I regretted leaving, but because I realized there was no going back to who I'd been before. No more appeasement, no more invisibility, no more borrowed safety. Whatever happened next, I would face it without the illusion of belonging. I sat on the floor, my back against the couch, knees pulled to my chest, and let the fear wash through me instead of fighting it. Because at the bottom of everything, beneath the grief, the doubt, the loneliness, there was one truth I couldn't escape. I had told the truth. And even if it cost me everything, I knew I could live with that. The question was whether I was strong enough to survive what came next. The shift didn't come with a victory speech or a sudden surge of confidence. It came quietly, on a gray Monday morning, in a federal office that smelled like stale coffee and paper. I sat across from Agent Jennifer Hayes, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my pulse steady in a way that surprised me. I had spent the weekend thinking, replaying every possible outcome until my mind was exhausted. By the time Monday arrived, the fear had settled into something else. Resolve. "I'll cooperate," I said before she could ask. "Fully." Agent Hayes studied me for a moment, then nodded. "That's the smartest decision you could have made." We went through everything, methodically, patiently. I explained how I'd noticed patterns in Brandon's finances, how shell companies left fingerprints the same way buildings did, how arrogance breeds sloppiness. I handed over documents, explained emails, clarified timelines. At no point did I embellish. At no point did I minimize. I told the truth, even when it didn't make me look good, especially then. "Why didn't you report this sooner?" Agent Hayes asked. I paused. "Because I loved my husband," I said simply, "and I hoped I was wrong." She didn't judge me for that. When I left the building hours later, the city looked the same. But I didn't. Something had realigned inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. Over the next weeks, the fallout intensified. The Sterlings hired the best criminal defense attorneys in California. They hired crisis PR firms. Private investigators dug through my past, searching for dirt. They found nothing. So they invented it. Stories appeared suggesting I'd had an affair, that I'd plagiarized architectural designs, that I had gambling debts. None of it was true. But truth wasn't the point. Damage was. My lawyer filed defamation suits, not because we expected to win, but because it drew a line. It told them I wasn't retreating anymore. 3 months later, something unexpected happened. There was a knock at my door. I checked the peephole and froze. A young woman stood in the hallway, early 20s, tense, determined. "Ms. Morrison," she said when I opened the door. "My name is Emily Sterling, Brandon's daughter." She sat on my couch, hands clenched together, staring at the floor. "My father's going to prison," she said finally. "Everyone knows it, even him." "I'm sorry," I said automatically. "Don't be," she replied. "He did this." She lifted her gaze to meet mine, clear, steady. "I need you to know something. I'm going to testify for the prosecution." The words landed heavy. "That will destroy your relationship with your family," I said carefully. "I know," Emily replied. "But you told the truth, even when it cost you everything. How could I do less?" I recognized the look in her eyes. I'd been wearing it for months. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want to know if you think I'm doing the right thing." I thought about it, about cost, consequence, and the long shadow of truth. "I think you're doing the hardest thing," I said. "Whether it's right depends on what you can live with." She didn't hesitate. "I can't live with silence." When she left, I stood alone in my apartment and realized something fundamental had changed. I was no longer the woman who needed permission to be believed. The power had shifted, not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped asking for validation from people who thrived on withholding it. Whatever came next, the trial, the fallout, the wreckage, I would face it as myself, not as someone's wife, not as someone's charity case, but as a woman who finally understood her worth. The trial began 8 months after that dinner. By then, the story no longer belonged to the Sterlings. It belonged to the public. I sat in the courtroom gallery on the first day, surrounded by reporters, observers, and strangers who had opinions about my life without knowing my name. Cameras clicked softly. Whispers followed me down the aisle. I kept my head up anyway. Across the room, Brandon Sterling sat at the defense table in a perfectly tailored suit, posture confident, expression composed. He looked like a man who still believed money could bend reality if applied with enough force. Behind him sat his family: Michael, Charles, Patricia. They all looked smaller somehow. Not poorer, just diminished. As if the illusion they'd worn for decades had finally slipped, revealing something brittle underneath. The prosecution was methodical. They didn't rush. They didn't dramatize. They built the case brick by brick. Shell companies, offshore accounts, layered transactions. Emails where Brandon joked about clients being too stupid to notice. Financial experts testified. IRS agents followed money trails with the patience of people who knew exactly where they led. Then came the victims. An elderly woman who had trusted Brandon with her retirement after her husband died. She cried on the stand, explaining how she'd lost everything. "I trusted him," she said. "He made me feel safe." A nonprofit director testified next. His scholarship fund, $14 million, had been decimated. "We were supposed to send 200 students to college," he said quietly. "Now we can barely send 70. That's 130 futures gone." The courtroom was silent. By the end of the second week, the pattern was undeniable. Brandon didn't just break laws. He preyed on trust. Then it was my turn. I took the stand and answered the prosecutor's questions carefully. My name, my profession, my relationship to the defendant. I explained how I'd noticed inconsistencies, how I'd compiled evidence, how I hadn't acted because I'd hoped I was wrong. "Why didn't you report it immediately?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I loved my husband," I said, "and I didn't want to destroy his family." The defense attorney tried to tear me apart. He called me deceptive, vindictive, a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge. "Isn't it true," he asked sharply, "that Brandon Sterling struck a nerve when he suggested you married into wealth?" "Yes," I said honestly, "it did." Murmurs rippled through the room. "But that doesn't make the evidence false." Then Emily Sterling took the stand. The air shifted. Michael's face drained of color. Patricia gasped. Brandon didn't look at her. Emily spoke calmly about her childhood, about overhearing phone calls, about learning early that her father believed rules were for other people. "I'm not here because I'm angry," she said. "I'm here because I don't want to become him." It was the most devastating testimony of the trial. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, I held my breath. On count 1, tax evasion, guilty. On count 2, money laundering, guilty. 19 counts, guilty on all of them. Brandon didn't react at first. Then his shoulders sagged just slightly. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Not hatred, not rage, understanding. 3 weeks later, he was sentenced. 30 years in federal prison. Parole eligibility after 22. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked at me once. Not with anger, but with something like acceptance. Michael didn't look at me at all. The next morning, divorce papers arrived. No contest. No demands. I signed them without hesitation. 8 years ended with ink. The fallout didn't end there. The Sterling name collapsed. Clients fled. Friends distanced themselves. Invitations stopped. Power evaporated when people realized it no longer protected them. And me? I walked away quietly. No victory lap. No revenge, just distance. Because the truth had done what it always does eventually. It returned everything to its rightful owner. The library opened in April. There were no cameras, no speeches worth quoting. Just a ribbon, a pair of dull scissors, and a crowd that didn't know or care about Sterling scandals or federal trials. Children ran toward the reading nooks. Teenagers clustered around the computer stations. Elderly neighbors traced spines of books with careful fingers. The building breathed the way I'd imagined it would, quietly useful, welcoming without asking permission. This is beautiful work. I turned. A woman stood behind me, smiling softly. She looked lighter than I remembered, like someone who had set down a weight she'd been carrying too long. "Amy," I said. "I promised I'd come back if he went to prison," she replied. We walked through the space together. She told me about the years she'd spent watching, waiting, surviving, about the relief of no longer looking over her shoulder, about starting over somewhere small and anonymous. "How are you?" she asked. "Really?" I considered the question. "I'm okay," I said finally. "Some days are harder. I still think about my marriage sometimes, but I'm building something that's mine." That night, I sat alone on my balcony, the city lights humming below. My phone buzzed, an unfamiliar number. "Michael, I know I don't deserve to say this, but you were right. About my brother, about my family, about all of it. I'm sorry I didn't defend you. You deserved better." I read it 3 times. Then I typed a single reply. "Thank you for saying that. I hope you find peace." And I blocked the number. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. Some chapters don't need revisiting. My life now is smaller than it was before. Quieter. There are no estates, no galas, no carefully curated rooms where everyone is performing status. There is work I believe in, sleep that comes easier, a mirror that doesn't ask me to explain myself. 3 years later, a letter arrived, forwarded through an attorney. Brandon's handwriting was cramped, controlled. He wrote that he finally understood, that he'd mistaken cleverness for worth, that he'd spent his life trying to win rooms instead of becoming someone who deserved to be in them. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond, because forgiveness wasn't required for closure, and validation was no longer something I needed from the Sterling family. The world kept turning. The city kept building. Children learned to read in spaces I helped shape. And in a small apartment filled with drafts and light, living a life entirely my own, I finally understood the lesson that cost me everything to learn. Sometimes the only way to build something real is to walk away from the life that was never truly yours.